Buonasera a tutti. I'm now switching to English, but I just want to remember that in Italy, everything that happens after noon can already be subsumized under good evening. So, welcome to this third panel. My name is Michael Baier, and the speakers on this panel, whom I wholeheartedly welcome, will evaluate the present situation and the challenges we face today. And actually, it was the present situation which induced the IHRA to take up this topic and to organize the seminar when in the autumn plenary in Hungary in 2015, we were overwhelmed by the refugee movements, and we just said, we have to do something about this. We have to try to use the acquis of our historians and try to compare their experiences to what is happening now and what can be done. So, as I said, since mid-2015, as a result of the crisis and civil wars in the proximity of Europe, the number of people eager to migrate has drastically risen. The development finds its reflection not only in the tragic events in the Mediterranean and in the massive increase of illegal trafficking, but also in the increasing number of applications for asylum in some member states of the European Union. And the first part of the exercise will be how have Europe and the European Union and its member states responded to the current crisis. We have asked Mr. Stefan Lehne to address these complex questions. I apologize by being very short on the biographies because they are available to you on the desk in front where you can read extensively about our speakers. I would just like to mention that Mr. Lehne is a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Foundation in Brussels, where he researches the development of the European Union's foreign policy after the Lisbon Treaty entered into force. And he gives specific focus on the relations between the European Union and its member states. Recently, Mr. Lehne has done some significant work on the EU and the refugee crisis, and I can only recommend to visit his contributions on that topic on the Carnegie Foundation's website. Stefan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Michael. First, I'd like to thank the organizers for bringing us together here and for including me. I consider it a huge privilege even to be in this room for a number of hours. It's fascinating. Now, there were at least 5 big reasons why the EU found it so difficult to deal with the refugee crisis of 2015-2016. The first one is that the migration and asylum regimes of the EU and the Schengen system are really fair weather constructions. By creating the freedom of movement for all Europeans and by creating a passport travel-free zone, the EU has actually created some kind of state-like space. But it left crucial powers on migration and asylum with the member states of the European Union. And the economic logic that drove the EU in this direction, towards Schengen, towards freedom of movement, completing the internal market, obscured the political and constitutional implications. By creating Schengen, the member states abandoned the traditional power of the state to control who comes in and who goes out. But they did not integrate their migration and asylum policies sufficiently. They didn't create a sufficiently strong institutional base to make the system resilient in the case of an asymmetric crisis. The second point is that the EU's strength lies in developing rules, basically, in long technocratic negotiations that in the end lead to a compromise about complicated issues. It's not constructed for executive action, basically. I recently saw a very interesting documentary on these crucial days from the 4th to the 6th of September 2015, when the refugees from Hungary started to move towards the Austrian border, Mr. Orban then sent them buses, and then Chancellor Faymann of Austria panicked and called Mrs. Merkel, and Mrs. Merkel then decided to allow these people coming in. It was fascinating to see that the EU was completely absent from this discussion. All these key decisions that were the critical decisions of the overall crisis happened on a national basis. And of course, the same lack of executive capacity hampered the EU's ability to help Greece through concrete assistance, translators, advisors, etc., than in the later course of the crisis. The third point is that the EU was, of course, very much divided. There were the states of first arrival, mainly Greece and Italy, which had to apply theoretically this very unfair Dublin rule that they were responsible for dealing with the asylum cases of the people who arrived on their shores. They didn't really apply this rule, but allowed most of the people to move up north. Then there were the transit countries such as Slovenia and Croatia, who had mainly one interest, or even Austria to a large extent, mainly one interest to move people on as rapidly as possible. And then there were the states of final arrival. These were Sweden, Germany, to some extent also in Austria, because 90,000 people in 2015 ended up in Austria. And these countries were overwhelmed by the burden. They appealed for solidarity, and they found very little. And these kind of divisions really hampered the decision-making of the EU on this issue. But there were also, and that's the fourth point, huge clashes of attitudes, basically. You had the Willkommenskultur in Germany, the readiness, the openness to welcome hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees on the one hand, and then you had, from the beginning, in Hungary and in a number of other countries, a much, much more restrictive attitude, where basically refugees were not welcome. And these different attitudes have historical roots. I think Germany has a lot to do with what we talked about in previous panels here. And in the Visegrad countries, I think the fact that they were isolated from the effects of globalization for many decades made it much more difficult to accept a large number of countries with a different people from a different cultural and religious background than it is for Belgium or Germany, that have been exposed to globalization for a much longer period of time. I think the moment where this contrast of attitudes became most painful was in the discussion on burden sharing, on the relocation of refugees. In the end, through majority vote in September 2015, was decided to relocate 160,000 refugees from Italy and Greece, but to this day, only about 12,000 people have been effectively relocated. And the fifth reason why the EU did so poorly is that in the case of stress, because of the kind of flimsiness of the European discussion, many member states relapsed to sorting to national action to put this under control by building fences, reimposing border control, defining ceilings for the intake of refugees. And here is a huge difference to the Euro crisis that the EU had to deal with a few years earlier. In the Euro crisis too, you had big divisions between the North and the South, the debtors and the creditors, between the ins and the outs of the Euro, but you had a common enemy, and the common enemy were the financial markets. And faced with the catastrophe of breakdown of the Eurozone, it was possible to overcome these differences and to actually deepen integration in this area. Whereas with the refugee crisis, you have the alternative of national action, and that made it so difficult for the EU collectively to handle this crisis better. During the last months of 2015, however, some sort of new restrictive consensus emerged in the European Union. Even Mrs. Merkel recognized that faced with these numbers, the first priority must be to to reduce the inflow. And this new consensus made it possible to agreed to the closure of the Balkans route in February 2016, and then to the EU-Turkey agreement in March 2016. Both measures reduced the entry very significantly. By 80%, the entries on the Balkans route were reduced. But of course, the agreement with Turkey has been implemented only partially. Some conditions were not fulfilled. Part of the compensation with Turkey, such as visa liberalization, has not happened so far. And also the agreement remains fragile due to the very, very tense and difficult relationship between the EU and Turkey. There was no success on the central Mediterranean route. In the power vacuum following the overthrow of Gaddafi, the EU lacks a counterpart with which to actually agree on deals and solutions for this issue. Consequently, people smuggling continued, and in 2016, actually, the number of migrants went up to 181,000, which is 20% more than in the year before. However, most of the migrants that cross from Libya to Italy now are what the EU considers economic migrants. Only people from Somalia and Eritrea have some kind of chance to be recognized as refugees. I think very sadly, despite lots of rescue efforts by the EU maritime mission, but also many NGOs, the number of people who died in the Mediterranean increased again greatly. More than 4,500 people drowned in the Mediterranean in 2016. Very sadly, I would think the EU is getting used to this death rate. If you remember, in 2014 and 2015, there were 2 cases where within 1 week, 500, 600 people drowned. And as a response to that, the European Council came together. There was a lot of attention in the media and public discussion, and some action was decided to counter this. This aspect of it, the tragic death of 4,500 people, is barely mentioned this day anymore. People are hugely excited about the death of 160 people due to Islamist terrorism in the year 2016. But compared to this much heavier death rate is largely ignored. In recent months, particularly during the latest EU summit in Malta, a lot of focus was on dealing with the inflow of people from Libya to Italy. In the absence of a silver bullet like the Turkey-EU agreement, the focus was on cooperation with the Libyan, training of the Libyan Coast Guard, of strengthening somehow border controls in the south of Libya, in improving the reception capacity in Libya, and on helping. I think this is particularly the IMO is engaged on this, programs for the voluntary returns of migrants to their home countries. One idea that didn't make it in the final document, but I think that will be much discussed in the coming months, is the idea of external processing of asylum requests. The idea is that you could have in Tunisia, in Egypt, maybe even in Libya, camps where asylum procedures are being processed, where people are kept, and only the successful asylum claimants would then be admitted to the EU. I think this concept poses enormous legal, political, and practical difficulties, but I think it will be much discussed over the coming months. As you've already seen from what I said before, during this crisis era, it's been very difficult to differentiate the issues between refugees and irregular migration. While there are totally different legal regimes that apply to the 2 cases, the 2 groups of people sit in the same boat, even literally. And over the last year, more and more economic migrants have taken to claim asylum because they know that their chances of being returned will be significantly reduced. And this, of course, overburdens the asylum procedure and affects the genuine political refugees very negatively. But on the other hand, if you look at it in terms of moral philosophy, someone who cannot survive in his place of origin, who has to flee. In terms of morals, these people have a similar moral claim to people who escaped from a civil war. So I believe that the legal regimes that we have are a legacy of the aftermath of the Second World War. I don't think it's practical or realistic to change it. These were huge achievements at that time. If we try to negotiate another refugee convention, it will be much more restrictive, but it needs to be borne in mind that this doesn't really do justice to the actual concrete situation. Now, a lot of attention has been devoted also by the EU on the external management of migration. There's been a summit with the African countries in Valletta in November 2015, and last summer the EU launched the so-called migration partnership concept. Essentially, this is mainly focused on offering African countries more financial assistance in exchange for a greater cooperation on defeating people smuggling and on the return of unsuccessful asylum seekers and irregular migrants to their home countries. I think it has turned out very clearly over the last few months that these projects and programs, while they have their merits, will only deliver in a very long time. There's no quick solution to this issue. The refugee crisis had a huge impact on the political climate in Europe. In many countries, the populist forces gained ground, and they are driving mainstream politicians towards more and more restrictive policies on migration and on refugees. The link of Islamic terrorism with the refugee inflows, which I think is a fact, even though most of the terrorist attacks have been committed by European nationals, by members from the member states, still has poisoned the atmosphere and created a great deal of feeling of insecurity. So while the EU has been successful in 2016 in reducing the inflow of people, it remains far from achieving really sustainable policies. I think we are more and more driving into the kind of the dream of Fortress Europe, the possibility of actually keeping people out primarily. And this emphasis on deterring further asylum seekers makes the integration of those who are already in Europe much more difficult. We have seen over the last months sort of a race to the bottoms in terms of the protection standards and reception conditions. Many states have curtailed the financial assistance. They've curtailed the freedom of movement, and they made the access to social services and the labor market more difficult. So this might actually deter some people from coming to Europe, but at the same time it greatly impedes the chances of those who are already there to lead successful lives. The terrible risk of the spreading anti-migration feeling is that it can easily turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy. Those who claim that Muslims and Africans have no place in Europe create a social and political climate that hampers the integration of the migrants already in place. And this rise of xenophobia and Islamophobia will not only cover relations to the migrant communities, it will poison all of political life in Europe, basically. So at the end, what should be done? I think the key thing, the most important thing is actually to mobilize against xenophobia and Islamophobia. The populist rightist groups claim that they are defending the achievements of Judeo-Christian civilization. But in real terms, the opposite is true. Fighting this xenophobia is the defense of Judeo-Christian civilization. Secondly, I think it's a complete illusion to believe that individual member states of the EU can handle the migration issues through more and more national action. What one needs is clearly much deeper integration. There is a need for more harmonization in the migration and asylum legislation. There are many proposals by the Commission on the table, but there is very little progress in terms of concrete outcomes. Secondly, I think burden sharing is crucial, is essential. I think it's an illusion to believe that we can return to a functioning Schengen system without some kind of relocation burden sharing arrangement in which all countries, even the most reluctant ones, participate and make their contribution. Thirdly, we need stronger institutions. The EU has made some progress in this from new border guard agency, but also EASO, this small organization supporting the asylum system, needs to be significantly strengthened. On the external dimension, I think it's true that we need stronger and more effective control over the external borders, but we should have no illusions that it can be perfect. We can't build a wall. I think the whole discussion in the United States from the European perspective is a bit absurd, because the US is in a position objectively to control the inflow of people much more effectively than Europe will ever do. There are 500 million people living in the neighboring states. There is a dense network of social and economic ties. To believe that we can simply keep everyone out is a complete illusion. Unfortunately, an illusion that many politicians in Europe now cling to. There is a need to, I think, revise our arrangements with third countries. This needs to be genuine, equitable partnerships, and the exclusive focus now on sort of financial compensation to cooperation on restricting migrations is not sufficient. I think we need also elements of creating legal pathways for people to come to Europe, maybe on a temporary basis, circular migration, and we need a much stronger emphasis on ways to resettle refugees directly from the crisis regions to Europe. There's sort of a catch-22 here. I think as long as these large irregular inflows continue, member states are hugely reluctant to engage in kind of genuine resettlement projects. But these are, I think all the experts agree, that the better ways to solve the issue. This, of course, should also be integrated with much stronger effort on the global level. There was the UN summit last September. Follow-up is planned, but I think in the era of Trump it will be very difficult to achieve much progress in this area. Final word, I think for the EU this is really an existential crisis. If the EU survives, it cannot live in the context of increasing nationalist feelings all over the place. It will eventually lose its sort of attractive power, its credibility, its legitimacy. The only way for the EU to have a future is actually to come to a grip with this problem in a more successful way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefan, for a very clear presentation of a very complex topic and for doing all that within the time limit. I'm sure your deliberations will trigger off a lot of questions. I'm not so sure if we can answer them. Let me make one remark, because this present development really contrasts significantly to what happened in Europe during the Balkan Wars of the 90s, when there was an overall expressed solidarity towards refugees, as well as from the governments, as well as from the population. That was the last time we saw such a development. Unfortunately, this got lost. So I may now turn to the question of how to deal with the present situation on the international field, the non-governmental organizations and the international organizations. And let me sincerely thank Archbishop Tomasi for having addressed yesterday this topic and giving a very, very concise overview over the international acquis, the instruments we have at our disposal. And of course, I have to emphasize it's important that we make something of them. In this context, I also would like to reiterate what Stefan said about the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, which the General Assembly adopted on the 13th of September 2016. It expresses the political will of the world leaders to save lives, to protect rights, and share responsibility on a global scale. And it contains a catalogue of commitments, both to address the issues we face now and to prepare the world for future challenges. But where do we stand now, and what has become of these commitments, and what would be their perspectives? And we have asked an international lawyer working in an international organization with expertise in legal framework and the rights and obligations of this framework creates for individuals and states. So I would like to heartily welcome Ms. Kristina Touzenis. She's the head of the International Migration Law Unit in the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, and therefore is responsible for the activities related to international and regional law issues. And she's also an active teacher in this material. So Kristina, we are happy to have you, and please take the floor.
Ma prima io ringrazierei per un rimpatrio per quanto breve a Roma, che apprezzo molto. Well, I was asked here to talk about definitions in the international legal framework, the protection that we find in the international legal framework, the role of international organizations, both UN and NGOs, and speak briefly to the Global Compact on migration, all within 15 to 20 minutes. Not at all a daunting task. So I have a number of notes here which all start with briefly talk about. We'll see if I can manage to do that. If I start about talking about the definitions, I'll just say that what I'm going to talk about mostly is the rights and the legal framework which is applicable to everybody, all migrants, everybody on the move. And obviously the most important in that context in the international legal branches will be the human rights framework, the 9 core human rights conventions. But it's also elements what we find in protection against trafficking, in protection against smuggling, the rules that we find in the law of the sea on rescue and search and rescue, for instance. So when we talk about migrants, we talk about people who are moving but who do not fall within the refugee definition. Refugees are a specific group of migrants. But when I talk about the protection of migrants, I talk about the protection of all people. Because everybody is deserving of having their rights respected without any sort of distinction and any sort of discrimination. The challenge, I think, is to make it understandable and easy to grasp for everybody that the rights that we find codified in the international treaties are relevant for everybody. And that if you have never thought about what rights you have in the international legal framework, it's probably because you were lucky, because you never thought about the need to be protected from violations of those rights. So I would like to really underline that nobody is more deserving of protection than others. Now, when we talk about refugees, refugees have a well-founded fear of persecution according to the convention. But as was just mentioned, people move for a variety of reasons and their life might be in danger, not because they're persecuted, but for instance, because they cannot make a living. Their life is in danger because of natural disasters. And they might also turn to moving in order to find better livelihoods. But that does not make them not forced to move. It is a less forced movement than if you are persecuted, but their possibilities at home were so limited that they decided to get on a boat, cross the Mediterranean, and risk their lives. So that tells us a lot about what conditions they were moving from. I also think that we need to remember that the rights we talk about are the same for everybody. States assume obligations under international law to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. And these obligations are also broadly encoded by national human rights standards and regional instruments, which apply to all, regardless of nationality or administrative status. So that means that the human rights which are valid for us here in this room are the same human rights which are valid and applicable to migrants. The basic question is, would you like what is happening to some of these people who arrive to happen to you without any limit to the power of states on how they treat you? If the answer to that is a categorical no, then there's something wrong, not in the level of protection that's granted legally, but in the implementation. Because then clearly we are discriminating in the way we implement our international obligations. Now, when we talk about having a human rights-based framework for migration, that would ensure the application of the obligations that we find in the international level to protect migrants from abuse. It's a framework based on the principles of equality and non-discrimination and the duty of states to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights, which include the right, for instance, to access to justice, something that migrants suffer from a lot. We also need to understand when somebody has a responsibility to protect, respect, and fulfill our rights. And that is basically when we are under the jurisdiction of a state. So the moment the state has the power to decide upon our fate, that state has the obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill our human rights. That also means, for instance, when we talk about irregular labor migrants, that at the moment they are on the territory of a state, that state has obligations towards them. That does not necessarily mean that they have a right to stay there, but if they are staying there, then they have the right to be protected and their rights should be respected. So how can we make it clear that the standards we find at the international level is relevant to all of us? How can, for instance, something as abstract to a certain extent as the right to life, which we find in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Right, be made relevant to us? Because it simply states that everybody has the right to life. Well, what does that mean? We need to look to national legislation because national legislation will safeguard our rights. We need to look to case law to understand what that means. And we also need to understand that it simply means in many cases that states create a social order where we are all safe. If we can walk down the street of Rome or Geneva or wherever we live and feel safe and feel protected, go to school, go to work, have enough to eat, have a home to go home to, that means that the state is living up to its obligations to protect us. And that is something that the state should do for everybody. Abuses of rights of migrants is not insulated incidents that takes place in a vacuum. For instance, if we talk about migrant workers, unethical recruitment practices thrive in an environment in which the prices of goods and services are dependent upon a supply of cheap labor. Ethical recruiters struggle to compete within a system that has adapted to a vicious cycle of wholesale exploitation and systematic suffering. It was mentioned this morning that we all have a role to play, and we do. We need to take into consideration when we buy our goods, who has produced them. We need to take into consideration when we make policies that migration is not only located in the migration department, so to speak. It is a question of labor policies, it's a question of security, it's a question of the rule of law. And the rule of law should be applicable and valid for everybody. And that means that they should also protect migrants. Now, if I move on to the role of the UN and international organizations, if we look to the history of rights, then the rights we find as we find them today codified in international law is obviously an outcome of a historic development. And I really, really hope that the international community today is more than the sum of its member states. States are not little fluffy animals with a will of their own. States are represented by governments, and governments are held accountable for their actions. And the UN has by now a history which should give it a role in which it can say there are certain rules in place that govern how states behave. And I really, really hope that we're going to hold on to that, because otherwise we're going to throw away centuries of development of protection of the individual. If we allow the erosion of rights of one group of individuals who benefit from the exact same rights that we have, but suffer more from lack of implementation, if we allow that, then we enter into a slippery slope, and we might, for no fault of our own, fall into the next category of people where states thinks, why can't we erode those rights too? And I think that in order perhaps to hold on to that system of multilateralism and of rights and of respect, we hope, for rights, we need to also talk a little bit a different language and speak a language that the people who hold governments accountable can understand. And I have to say that to a certain extent, probably we have failed. When I go out and I talk about the obligation to respect rights, when I talk about how we should treat other people nicely because there's a legal framework there in place for them, sometimes it just doesn't get through. But I think it might get through if we make people aware of the fact that the rights that we insist are respected for one group of people are no different from your rights. And you might be the next person who sees your rights violated with nobody there to step in to try to help you. If we make it about you, then perhaps people will start to listen, I hope. One thing I would like to see a lot more of is legal channels for migration. We talk about the migration crisis today. Well, we wouldn't have a migration crisis if people could actually come into our countries legally, with labor migration channels, as well as with family reunification, as well as with facilitated entry for refugees. If we have legal channels for labor migration, we would also not have the strain on the refugee system, which now can be there because people think that it's the only way to enter a country. Walls, as we say, probably will not keep people out. I actually visited the wall at the US-Mexican border, and I can tell you it has very little effect apart from pushing the migration channels underground into the hands of traffickers, into the hands of smugglers. And as states, we lose control over who enters our territory. If we have legal channels, we know who's there, we know why they're there, and they don't risk their lives. Now, one thing that I've also noticed when we talk about migrants' rights is that we need to speak a language, as I said, that everybody can understand, but we also need to understand ourselves that migrants have rights. If you go and talk to people who work on women's rights, even if they're not lawyers, even if they work on, for instance, women's health, they never ever doubt that women have rights. If you speak to people who work on children's rights, even if their daily job is to install toilets or sanitation for children, they don't speak a rights language, but they never ever doubt that children have rights. For some reason, people who work on migration doubt that migrants have rights sometimes. And it automatically seeps into the way we talk. And that automatically damages the respect and the implementation for rights. So we need to really be aware, those of us who work in this field, that migrants have the same rights as everybody else. It's the implementation that's something that's lacking. And it's something that you encounter a lot when you work on international legal frameworks, is that people say, oh, but there's something wrong with implementation. Yes, but is that a reason to give up? Because if that's a reason to give up, then we have also admitted that my rights and your rights, well, they're not that important. Now, a last point is, I think we really need to speak about facts, the real facts, not the alternative facts. We need to get numbers out there, because if we were to allow people to enter into our territories as destination countries, and we actually made calculations, the numbers really are not very scary. And that's another thing that we need to use. We also need to not only talk about individual rights, but talk about what happens to societies if individual rights are not respected. If we have a number of irregular migrants on our territory whose labor rights are not respected, we automatically create segments of the labor market which depends on irregular labor and which does not follow internet or national standards in labor regulations, for instance. And that is bad for the society as a whole. We need to think about creating legal channels. We need to think about creating alternatives to detention for people who arrive, because the detention facilities that we see around the world are horrendous, but detention itself is in many cases actually unlawful. And again, the question is, would you like that to happen to you? Probably not. So I think we need to speak a language about rights which makes it relevant for each and every one of us to safeguard the rights of every one of us, because otherwise we might be the next in line for when a group of people see their rights eroded. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kristina, and I especially commend you for pointing out that the protection of migrants is enshrined in the principles of the rule of law. This is extremely important because, unfortunately, we still lack a legally binding universal instrument on the treatment of migrants. And I also want to really thank you for quoting Immanuel Kant with the words, "Would you like this to happen to you?" I'm sure if he was here today, he would have said the same thing. And this I can now lead over to the other two speakers who will now address very directly the problem, how these developments affect the refugees. And I'm happy to introduce to you Msgr. Giovanni Pietro dal Toso, Delegated Secretary of the newly created Dicastery for the Promotion of Integral Human Development. Msgr. dal Toso was the Secretary of the Pontifical Council Cor Unum following his appointment by Pope Benedict in 2016. He will address several key issues which he deems crucial for a better understanding of the refugee problem, and of course he will also highlight some perspectives in the light of view from the Holy See. Msgr, you have the floor.
Thank you. Dear friends, thank you for the invitation to take part to this distinguished assembly. I was asked for a speech on the Holy See's current activities, in particular regarding the situation of refugees in the Middle East. So after a brief exposition of this situation, I will present 4 key areas for an interpretation of the phenomenon and then describe 4 concrete prospects from the point of view of the Holy See. First point, the situation. Migration is as ancient as humanity, and it has not always amounted to forced migration. At present, as you already know, the most consistent flows are those towards North America and those moving towards Europe from Africa and the Middle East. In this case, we are talking for the most part about forced migration. In fact, in the Middle East, we can observe the following trends. A. Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan are countries with high rates of immigration. The first two also have a right number of internally displaced persons. The figures are impressive. Among those arriving in Greece in 2016, 85.9% were coming from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. In the United States, 30% of refugees who arrived in 2016 were coming from those 3 countries. B. In the Middle East, there are countries with a high level of reception. In Lebanon, there are officially 1.1 million refugees. In Jordan, there are 664,000 refugees. In Turkey, 2.5 million. And in Iran, approximately 1 million. To those, we must add all those refugees who for decades have been residing in these nations on a permanent basis. C. Finally, we must not forget that there is the vast phenomenon of silent migration caused by the search for a job and well-being towards the Middle East, and in particular to the Arabian Peninsula, especially from India, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. We have for such a country in the Gulf state, for example, 1,415,000 persons coming from these 5 countries. And now an analysis of the situation. In my opinion, to better understand the problem, we should break it down into at least 4 aspects. The first is the humanitarian aspect, to which even the Holy Father has very often referred, which results in the reception and welcome of those in need of immediate help. We as Christians have a moral duty to assist those in need, and I feel I can say that the Catholic Church is in the forefront, even in countries where Christians are a minority, in helping the needy. For the Catholic Church, it is perfectly clear that this must be done in accordance with the respective governments of the host countries. There are also international humanitarian laws binding governments to do their part in this process of reception. Based on the principle of subsidiarity, the Church is willing to do its part in this process, asks to do so, and even asks to take into consideration, in particular, those needs, such as spiritual needs, that would otherwise be easily overlooked. B. Once a refugee or migrant is welcomed or as such in a hosting country, we must consider the cultural aspect of the matter, humanitarian and the cultural aspect of the matter, which in turn presents 2 dimensions. The first is the integration of migrants through proper education and formation, and at a later moment, the search for a job and economic livelihood. We cannot therefore reduce refugees or migrants to beggars, but we must give them the opportunity to develop their talents, to integrate, and to put themselves at the disposal of the society in which they live. This phase integrates the initial one of reception and opens up the future for the person welcomed, thus avoiding the creation of ghettos. The second dimension of the cultural aspect is just as important and concerns the arriving communities. They must, that is, share the values and basic norms of the welcoming community. There is a part of reciprocal acceptance that calls for the responsibility of those who are being accepted. In his address to the Diplomatic Corps on 11th January 2016, the Holy Father stated, I quote, "The acceptance of migrants can thus prove a good opportunity for new understanding, a broader horizon, both on the part of those accepted, who have the responsibility to respect the values, traditions and laws of the community which takes them in, and on the other part, the latter, who are called to acknowledge the beneficial contribution which each immigrant can make to the whole community." End of the quotation. This aspect should not be overlooked because extremism and populism often feed on the fear for the other and thus on the fear of being crushed by people who we are not mutually acquainted with. Indeed, it is in light of this that we can comprehend the reaction of some European nations which have resisted the presence of migrants because they do not want to create cultural imbalances in their own countries. So there is a mutual relationship between rights and duties not to be ignored. C. There is also a political aspect of the matter, and I am referring in particular to Syria, Iraq and Afghanistan, who are at great extent countries of forced migration, because of their political instability. We cannot focus our attention on the consequences of the problem without considering its source. If the international community had promptly taken fairer action in Syria or in Iraq, millions of people would not have been forced to unwillingly leave their homes and their country. Even now, the anxiety over finding a solution to the refugee problem in Europe or other countries must not lead us to forget the real cause of this human exodus, which is war. After so many years, why have we been unable to find a peaceful solution for Syria or political stability for Iraq while they continue fighting unnecessary and bloody wars at the expense of the population? Or why has it taken the Paris bombings of November 2015 to realize that the Islamic State is a real threat, consequently deciding to oppose it with more determination? Finally, this is the first part of my analysis. Finally, there is an even more global aspect of the matter, and it is the equal distribution of goods on this earth. In the fall of 2015, I was very much impressed when the force of the masses swept over national borders on the Balkan route. In a certain sense, vital energy had imposed itself over an alleged order, however necessary, made up of borders and the police. In other words, if the Western world fails to implement serious policies of sharing, the poorer peoples will come to take for themselves what is ours. And what we have experienced so far will have been just the beginning of a much more complex and painful process. For this reason, popes have always stressed the importance of the integral development of the entire person and of every person, because if there is no real and equal distribution of property, injustice will only trigger violence and revenge. This is not only a moral appeal, but unfortunately the mere realization that we will be increasingly forced to transform our states into systems of control, repression, defense, if we do not rethink our model of development using a truly universal point of view. This year we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the encyclical Populorum Progressio, and even back then Paul VI said the effort to build a more human world community where all can give and receive and where the progress of some is not bought at the expense of others. This matter is urgent, for on it depends the future of world civilization. Third point and last point, future prospects. There are four, according to my opinion. In the first place, there are the political responsibilities that should compel the international community to find a solution to the many existing conflicts. If a large part of the refugees comes from politically unstable countries, then clearly there cannot be no solution to the problem without seeking peace and order in the various countries. The Holy See has often been actively involved in this aspect. B. I would also like to mention the great contribution of the Catholic Church to its various charitable organizations and also to the dioceses and the religious communities in assisting misplaced persons and refugees. Over the past 2 years, our dicastery carried out a survey to assess working areas, subjects reached, money spent by the different actors of the Catholic Church involved in the crisis in Syria and Iraq. From here, a number of facts of great interest. What distinguishes the involvement of the Catholic Church is the breadth of its actions, both as geographical distribution and as personnel engaged in responding to emergency situations. From a geographical point of view, the actions of the Church network cover a wide geographical area. almost all crisis areas and areas where there are migrants fleeing to neighboring countries to the region in conflict. There are also multiple actors which, with their own uniqueness, engaged on site directly or through local institutions. Currently, the church network includes, in the area of Syria and Iraq, more than 4,000 professionals, employees, and more than 8,000 volunteers. The large number of volunteers shows the importance of the daily commitment of local volunteers in the charitable field. Based on our survey over the past few years, 2014-2016, the church network has mobilized more than $530 million in 3 years as a response to the humanitarian crisis in Iraq and Syria, with priority areas in food aid, education, health sector, and non-food items. Among those areas of intervention, education and health are considered a priority. C. An element that is dear to the Holy See is the concept of the right to return, which should be formally and legally declared. I would like to mention the statement of the Secretary of State, Cardinal Parolin, on the situation of Christians in the Middle East during the ordinary public consistory on the Middle East of October 2014. I quote, "We reaffirm the right of refugees to return and to live in dignity and security in their own country and environment. It is a right which must be supported and guaranteed by the international community as much as by the states of which the displaced persons or refugees are citizens." This enables me to spend a few words on the presence of Christians in the Middle East, which has been fundamental to the growth and cultural development of these countries. The frequent and vigorous appeals of the Holy See in favor of the permanence of Christians in that region are not dictated only by the rightful concern that the holy places risk turning into cemeteries, being deprived of the daily presence of the faithful who live there, but also by the fact that the social fabric of those countries has greatly benefited from the presence of Christians. Just think of all the schools and of the systems of education. And finally, the third perspective, I would like to reaffirm that we need to take a clearer look at the link between war and political instability and forced migration, and between migration and underdevelopment. Only a clear-minded gaze can help us positively govern the problem of migration, which cannot be solved by rounding up the refugees in camps, perhaps turning them into permanent residences, but allowing people to live their life in peace and freedom, evidently in compliance with the established laws and order. And I would like to close this speech exactly with this concept, because men and women move in the name of their personal freedom. When I was in Lebanon, I asked a group of Syrian and Iraqi women if they would have liked to return to their home countries. The majority said that no, they would not, because in Lebanon they had experienced freedom. This is what putting the person at the center of our action means. This is the only way a society can hope to change without recurring to violence, by educating people to be responsible for their own freedom. The Church's role in the field of education is recognized by all, and her commitment to this field remains unalterated. So the search for peace, humanitarian assistance, the right to return, education to freedom are the prospects which I believe can contribute to finding a lasting solution to the issue of refugees, especially in the Middle East. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Monsignore, for this contribution. I can only echo what you said about the humanitarian engagement of the Catholic Church in non-Christian countries. Having served in Algeria, I witnessed the outstanding contribution of the Catholics there to the social development of the country, which has about 2,000 Christians compared to about 30 million Muslims. I also am grateful for you to mention the right of return, and for those who have not been here yesterday, I would like to reiterate that the right of return, as other elements of the Geneva Convention on Refugees, are also enshrined in other global human rights instruments that have a wider scope of acceptance than the Geneva Convention. Now that brings us to the final round of reflections. What are the perspectives of the refugees themselves? On one hand, the refugee perspectives are known to be as varied as the varied circumstances that generate the forced movement of people. On the other hand, all refugees experience in common their incredible endurance and rigidity confronted with such a persecution that compels people to flee. We have asked Dr. Mukesh Kapila, an expert member of the Refugee Crisis Group at the University of Manchester, to address these questions. Dr. Kapila is Professor of Global Health and Humanitarian Affairs, and he was Special Advisor to the first ever World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul in May 2016. You have the floor, Dr. Kapila.
Thank you. I'm asked here to speak on refugee perspectives. And so I wonder what Fatima would say if she could be here to speak for herself. Fatima is a refugee, but for some reason that I don't know, her invitation letter to this conference didn't get through, mainly because I think she lives in a freezing ramshackle shelter in the Bekaa Valley, midway between Beirut and Damascus. In fact, for the Christians here, my talk may be more appropriately entitled On the Road to Damascus. So she told me her story. Fatima squats on the threadbare carpet, and outside the wind is howling and the flakes of snow are piercing her torn canvas tent. And Fatima looks much older than her 50 years, and her toothless face beams with love, surrounded by her 7 grandchildren aged between 9 months and 13 years. And this is a story. And this happened just a few weeks ago when I was actually myself in the Bekaa Valley. We had a nice life near Damascus, but when the plane destroyed our house and killed my husband, I ran, she told me. She slipped across the border into Lebanon. Allah be praised. A kind man let me stay on his field and helped me build this home. The kind Samaritan was Elias, a small Lebanese businessman who owned the field that now houses 200 refugees. Earlier on, Elias had shown me around the camp. These are our own brothers and sisters, and the field was lying empty anyway, he told me. This wasn't a UN-registered refugee camp, and so it wasn't eligible for official help. But Elias had mobilized his local church to provide the necessities for living. Fatima served me tea while she continued her story. I had 2 sons. The elder and his wife died in an air attack in Aleppo. Luckily, the children had been at school. The younger son was press-ganged into a militia and killed somewhere. I don't know what happened to my second daughter-in-law. And then she described how she had gone back and forth across the border and crisscrossed several militia lines until she had rescued her scattered grandchildren, now clustered here like chicks around a mother hen. I marveled at her remarkable courage in facing the dangers she had encountered and her tenacious optimism despite the odds stacked against her. You must be so very angry at the people who did this to your family. You must be wanting revenge, I said somewhat lamely. Fatima pauses for a long moment. And then she says, enough blood has been spilled. I want my grandchildren to have a better life. They must be educated and get good jobs. She looks proudly at her eldest grandchild. He's good at maths and he wants to be an engineer. We will need many to rebuild our country. Humbled into silence, I prepare to leave. But I have a final job to do. It was almost Christmas Day, very recently, and Elias had a huge bag of chocolates donated by the surrounding community. Will you do us the honor to give them out, he asked me. Under a tin shed, which was the school created by the refugees who were also the teachers, several dozen kids shivered. Syria's future engineers, teachers, nurses, and doctors. Perhaps also peace builders, if Fatima was to have her wish. The last chocolate was for me to take for myself. Thanks for coming and have a happy new year, said Ilyas. And a fundraising leaflet on my car seat proclaimed, it's never cold with warm hearts. That evening, I was invited to meet with friends in fashionable downtown Beirut. In the taxi marooned in the city's famous traffic jams were groups of Syrian refugees, mothers and children selling small items as they darted in and out of the slow-moving traffic. Also, young Darfuri men appeared to have cornered the market in washing the car screens of reluctant drivers. I did not see them as unfortunate victims, but as enterprising and helpful and hopeful survivors. Fatima had changed my attitude. My benevolent thoughts were, however, interrupted by the taxi driver as he shooed away the refugees around our car. There are too many of them, and they're so dirty, he muttered. There followed a familiar litany of complaints about jobs, cost of living, overcrowding in schools and hospitals, crime, and so on. All blamed on the foreigners. I asked him about his own family, and without irony, the taxi driver said, my mother is from Iraq. She ran away from Saddam many years ago. She married my Lebanese father and became Lebanese himself. Lucky it was that way around, as a converse would not have worked. A Lebanese woman marrying a refugee cannot confer her nationality on him. As I tried to get my head around these obvious inequalities, my driver vented his opinions. I learned then that not all refugees are equal. As we learned this morning, that Jewish and non-Jewish displaced persons were not equal. After 70 years, the Palestinian refugees were just about being accepted. The large recent Syrian influx was beginning to strain the bonds of kinship, and the Sudanese were definitely unwelcome. A touch of racism, perhaps. I wondered as he added, they're not like us. As I waited for my friends at the restaurant, I pondered over my conversation. A staggering quarter of the 6 million population of Lebanon are refugees, and the tensions articulated by my driver are not surprising. But there seem to be much less than in hysterical Europe, where refugees are a tiny fraction of the total population despite the recent Syrian influx. It's also struck me that the Lebanese themselves are great emigrants. 3 times as many Lebanese live outside than in their own country. They're also very savvy. The Lebanese friends I was waiting all had second nationalities: Brazilian, US, Australian, French, British, and so on. Good insurance in times of trouble. And so for them, identity was not a matter of sentiment, but of practicality. Meanwhile, the Lebanese diaspora had spawned many artists, writers, businessmen, Nobel Prize winners, and had even provided major political leaders in their new countries. The benefits of migration cut both ways. The following morning, I went to a Palestinian Red Crescent hospital in central Lebanon. In the rehabilitation section, a Syrian mother recounted how her family had fled homes. Her 4-year-old son had autism, and the constant bombardments had so disturbed him that it had got impossible to manage his disruptive behavior. I could see that for myself as the little boy cowered between his mother's legs and lashed out at anyone who came near. Then his therapist, Bushra, walked in and cajoled the boy to sit still and take a green toy from her outstretched hand. An hour later, he could do it without scratching and snatching and was duly rewarded with an apple. This was a culmination of 2 months of therapy where Bushra had spent many hours with the severely disturbed child, a true labor of love. Bushra then spoke about herself. She was a highly trained speech and occupational therapist, but as a Palestinian refugee, she wasn't allowed formal employment in Lebanon. She was in her late 20s, born in Lebanon's oldest refugee camp for Palestinians, established in 1948. I had the chance to go to Canada as they needed speech therapists, but I want to help my own people, she told me. Now her skills were also much needed by Syrian refugees. Of course, Bushra had never been to Palestine. She was born in exile, but she clung to her identity as both a Palestinian and a refugee. But on Bushra's co-identity as a refugee, I was perplexed. Her grandparents may have been refugees, but why did that make her a refugee herself? Surely, refugeedom is not an inherited condition, or is it? I wondered if identity is just what you're labeled with by others to deliberately distance you. I'd seen this for myself in the sinister consequences when that happens to the extreme. I was myself present during the Rwandan genocide in 1994 when the Tutsis were murdered en masse by the Hutus. And in 2003-2004, I had found myself as head of the United Nations in Sudan, battling against the supremacist Arab regime in Khartoum, doing the same against Darfur's black African people. Bushra continued to brief me on what it was like to be a refugee, unable to live in dignity, make a proper living from her precious skills and talents, or to travel freely. She was quite matter-of-fact, and I marveled at her tolerant attitude and the compassionate professionalism with which she went about her duties, treating Palestinians, Syrians, Iraqis, refugees, all without distinction. Neither did she turn away their equally poor Lebanese hosts. Bushra even bought apples with her own meager income to give out to the little ones. So we drove together to the dilapidated old building, an official refugee center under UNHCR protection. Some 800 recent arrivals were housed in the cramped classrooms of what had once been a college. 3 families, some 15 people, shared each room. Rivulets of filthy water meandered through the corridors. Smoky fires glowed under the sheltered stairwells as people cooked their rations. We met up again with the Syrian mother and her autistic son, and were greeted by the rest of her family, all huddled under a quilt as heaters were not allowed in these living rooms due to the risk of fire. A tattered bed sheet and a few pieces of cardboard were nailed to the broken windows in feeble defense against icy wind that blew in. Why hasn't the glass been replaced in these windows? I cried out. It's easy and cheap to do and would make such a big difference here. I was informed that the officials in charge had decreed otherwise. Apparently, the refugee officials had said, this is a temporary camp, and we don't want the refugees getting too comfortable here. They may never leave then. I was appalled. In a lifetime spent at the humanitarian front lines of the world's worst crisis, I have never come across anyone who had willingly fled their own homes, and those that were pushed out either went back as soon as they could or toiled hard to make a better life for themselves. Yes, they could be stuck like the Palestinians in the region or Darfuris in neighboring Chad, sometimes for many, many years, due to circumstances outside their control. But nobody tarried longer than necessary in second-class limbo as a dependent refugee in a foreign land. I felt angry at the mindless bureaucrats who forced an uncomprehending autistic refugee child to shiver in the bitter depths of winter when they could easily bring a modicum of the comfort that their humanitarian mission demanded. Today, the humanitarian international business, yes, that's what it is, a business, valued at billions of US dollars, providing employment to tens of thousands of workers in hundreds of organizations. Some say it has become too large, and others it isn't big enough because humanitarian needs have expanded even further. Both views are right, but in any case, our methods do not know how to value compassion, and so the official statistics do not recognize the work of the likes of Elias and Bushra. That meant that no one had thought it worthwhile to plant any flag in Elias's muddy field, and 200 refugees like Grandma Fatima had no formal status as refugees. Thus, they were not entitled to official assistance and protection as mandated by the 1951 Refugee Convention. They relied on their own wits and the random kindness of strangers. When I'd seen them, they'd looked as happy and hopeful as anyone could be. I had felt good to be with them. In contrast, the 800 people in the old college building, were officially recognized as refugees. They had a blue UN flag flying on top, and they were being cared for after a fashion. But they were also subject to the random meanness of the official humanitarian system and looked miserable and hopeless. I had felt bad to be with them. I wondered then what I would want if I were forced to choose where to go in my own hour of greatest need. I'd also seen how Fatima refused to become victim of misfortune or to be bitter about the injustices inflicted upon her. She was busy planning for the future, and I learned from her the true meaning of resilience, a much used buzzword in the humanitarian business. She also brought hope, conveyed a vision of the future she wanted, and expressed determination to shape it. All these are the essential attributes of a natural leader. In another place, with other opportunities, Fatima could easily head one of our numerous international humanitarian organizations. If that happens, I wonder what she would say to my prejudiced taxi driver, himself the son of a refugee, migrant, but now wanting to build a wall against today's unfortunate refugees. I also wonder what she would say, what Fatima would say to the leaders of our great humanitarian political institutions drunk on their own platitudes. Elias had reminded me that the humanitarian instinct is innate in all of us. He had also told me more about the church that had rallied around the mostly Muslim Syrian refugees. It was in the Armenian Orthodox faith, catering for the spiritual needs of the descendants of the Armenian refugees that had fled the Ottoman Empire's genocidal program a century earlier. I could feel at that moment on that muddy field the connecting thread from Armenia to current-day Syria. A crime against humanity in one place at one moment in time is a crime against humanity in all places at all times. I'm not narrating an ancient parable as I come to an end. Mine was an actual present-day journey on the road to Damascus. Unexpectedly for me, it had turned out to be a crash course on the paradoxes of modern humanitarianism, including how we deal with our refugees and displaced. On the one hand, I had been greatly consoled by seeing how the milk of human kindness was still flowing, and how the poorest people were also the most generous. But on the other hand, I was badly disturbed by seeing how the humanitarian instinct was now being frittered away, or worse still, being stifled by those who had turned humanitarian work into just a job. On balance, I saw that the kindness still trumped cruelty, but this cannot be taken for granted. That then, my dear friends, is our challenge today. This morning, we talked about past history and how complicated it is when good and evil prevailed in equal measure. A new history is being made today. I just wonder what that will turn out to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kapila, for having shared your experiences with us on this very important perspective of the problem we are treating today. I also thank you for addressing the question of the unequal treatment of internally displaced and refugees. This is a problem which became especially ardent in the Syrian civil war. In fact, we are lacking a global legally binding instrument addressing the needs of the internally displaced. There is, however, and those who were here yesterday will recall what Msgr Tomasi said about the African Union that adopted a convention for the protection and the assistance of internally displaced persons in Africa. It's the so-called Kampala Convention, and it actually entered into force in 2012. So I wonder if you or Kristina could give us a little insight on how the implementation of this convention is proceeding, and if there is any thoughts about making this to a global instrument. Before I turn to the floor, I have a second question that I would like to put to Stefan. As we have stated in the last panel, the educational element is very important to IHRA. And all of what we are doing here is, of course, should have an educational output. And as Stefan has recently taught refugee law in the Diplomatic Academy in Vienna, I would be interested to hear the reactions of your students, especially as many of them are coming from the Balkans. Thank you. So maybe first on the African Convention. Anis?
Specifically to the African Convention, I can't speak very much, but what I'd like to underline, though, is that each international instrument that comes into being because of an experience. When we look at the 9 core human rights conventions, the 2 covenants that sort of cover economic, social, cultural rights and civil and political rights, and the 7 conventions that are either group-related or specifically on a theme, if the 2 core conventions were respected as they should be, implemented and with due regard to everybody, children, women, migrants, the elderly, the disabled, then we wouldn't need the other conventions, so to speak. The other conventions have come into being because we saw a specific need for specific groups. The elderly don't have a convention yet. Or because we saw specific violations, specific serious violations of specific issues, such as torture and forced disappearance. To be quite frank, I don't think that the international environment right now is in a convention-creating mode. But I would like to underline, though, that there is, as such, no lack of international legal protection, because human rights are valid for everybody. Human rights are not citizens' rights. Human rights are rights which are granted, legally binding to every human being. And apart from very few, such as political rights, they're granted to every human being on a national territory or under the jurisdiction of a state. And they cannot just be ignored. They need to be implemented with due regard for the needs of the individual. So I don't think as such there's a need to have a massive creation of more norms. There's a need now to move towards better implementation and not towards moving towards less implementation for certain groups, which is what we see, which is at risk right now when we talk about migrants and to a certain extent also towards refugees. I didn't talk at all about the principle of non-refoulement, which has been extended also to people who do not fall within the Refugee Convention. But we see, for instance, also the issues of extraterritorial processing, both of migrant claims as well as refugee claims, where it seems as if certain states want to push away their responsibility to protect these people. Well, according to international law, the moment you're under the jurisdiction of a state, then that state has responsibilities and obligations towards you. And it doesn't matter whether or not they outsource this to a private company or they outsource it and try to do it in another state. There is still an obligation to protect you. So I think that even if we are not in creation of more international norms mode in this time and this day and age, it's not the legal protection that's lacking, it's the implementation. And that's what I think we really need to be very, very careful when we talk about migrants, not to give the impression that there is no legal framework protecting them. The legal framework is there, we just need to make certain that it's applied to them.
Thank you very much, and I also would like to commend IOM for the enormous work they did, especially also in the historical view, where they played a very important role. Any thoughts about the students?
Well, actually, the students at the Diplomatic Academy well, slightly sort of untypical for the general population, I would think. They have, of course, their very international background. I was surprised how experienced they are also in this field. Some people had worked in refugee camps, and many people have been part of the massive mobilization of civil society in helping the refugees that came over the years 2015 and 2016. But what also came out in this discussion is a massive polarization of public opinion. Basically, you have, if people go to a party, for instance, my students, half of the people they can't talk to because they will have radically different views from themselves on these issues. So I think there is hardly any issue that divides European societies to the same extent. And with fake news and fragmenting of media, of course, many people listen only to messages that confirm views that they already hold. And this discussion with the students was, I think, showed that very clearly how they feel that it's extremely difficult even to have an informed public discourse these days about these issues because opinions are already so divided, many people even don't want to talk about it anymore.
Thank you, Stefan. So I think now we can ask the floor, the audience, whether there's any question coming up. Yes, please. I'll bundle 2 or 3. Yes?
Thank you. Enzo Lefebvre from the Budapest Center for Mass Atrocities Prevention. We are facing today an erosion of international law as we got to know it. We face an erosion of the meaning and the value of international norms and treaties and conventions that were there to protect us. How you face these challenges mostly as an organization that has joined now the UN system, so actually goes much more globally than it was before. And at the same time, I think I was struck by Mukesh in your sense of, I tweeted about it. We are thinking about refugees that are escaping from mass atrocities, and yet we don't. I mean, we now take care of refugees, but we don't empower actions to prevent mass atrocities from happening, and then have more and more refugees. Is there a solution to this never again situation? Thank you.
Maybe I'll take a second question and then we come. Yes? Professor Flaherty, please.
Thank you very much. Michael O'Flaherty from the EU Fundamental Rights Agency. I have a question for Mr. Lehne. I really appreciated your analysis. Your analysis was very convincing as to where we are and how we got here in terms of EU policy. I very much welcome hearing from you where we're going. It would be very interesting to get from you a political prognosis, even if it's only just limited to the situation in 2017. And I'll leave it there. I would like to jump into the debate on a number of points, but I have an opportunity later, so I'll wait for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Briefly responding to the question of the under-erosion of the international norms, of course we know that especially in the field of migration and refugees, the handling compliance with the norms is in the hands of political fora, for instance, the Human Rights Council and others. And there, of course, again, the political climate plays a role, which makes things complicated. But I'm sure that Kristina will have other or more detailed experience on that.
Well, I wish I could just come up with a lovely little solution to that. Apart from feeling that you're constantly hitting your head against the wall and want to break out crying, I think to a certain extent it really is up to us to insist that that erosion stops or does not take place. As a lawyer, it's very easy to say, this is the law, stop breaking it, right? But it's not as simple as that, obviously. First of all, I try really always to insist on the fact that the conventions we have there are negotiated outcomes. They did not just fall down and hit poor little states in the heads. They were negotiated, and states signed up to them, and they ratified them. As I said, now the real challenge is that we continue to, or that we start to implement them in a meaningful way for everybody. I also think that as an international community and as people who work on these issues and who have studied these issues, we do have an obligation to find a way to make the general public aware of what they face if the erosion starts and then subsequently continue. Because I honestly think that if the erosion starts with one group, it is going to continue to other groups. I can give a little silly example, which is a little bit plays into what you said, that there are people that the students just don't talk to. I have a group of friends. This is a real example, and might be a little bit silly, but it opened my eyes somehow. I have a group of friends in southern France, where my mom has a lovely little house, and I go riding there. And usually when I go to the stables, I never talk politics and I never talk work, also because I go there on the weekends, so I don't want to get into complex legal discussions, and particularly not in French. And I also know that these people are absolutely not stupid, intelligent people, but not necessarily particularly bookish. They didn't necessarily study very, very long time, and they started doing agriculture and horses. So they are not necessarily as informed about these issues as I am, and that's natural because I work in them. And then lately, I don't know why, I somehow got into this discussion, and I thought, no, this time I'm actually going to see it through. And I thought, okay, but I can't just come up with the usual, you know what, these people are coming and we need to be kind to them because we have an obligation to be kind to them. So instead, I started talking to them about my fears. And my fears is that sooner or later, I'm going to be the one who doesn't have a home to come home to. Sooner or later, I'm going to be the one knocking on somebody else's door and say, can you please give me protection? And that door will be closed. And I actually said, quite frankly, I'm very happy that I know you, because you have a nice little terrain where we can cultivate our tomatoes and our leeks, and we might even be able to survive. And they looked at me with these big, big eyes, and they were like, oh my God, do you think it will actually happen even to us? And like, it's not that difficult to imagine that one day we become the other. My grandmother was born just at the end of the First World War. She lived through the Second World War, and she saw the creation of the European Union, which is more than an economic market. It was created to create an area of peace and security where nationalisms could not raise and where we would never again have war. It's not that difficult to think that I, who was born with the European Union established, will see the exact opposite development. Our rights and the guarantees of our rights are not automatic. People worked for them for centuries, and if we just throw them away, then I'm scared. And for some reason, that discussion or that discourse actually went through to them. So I'm beginning to scare people. I'm beginning to stop having this discussion about we need to protect individuals because they deserve it. Because anyhow, they're the others. And the others deserve rights a little bit less. So I'm beginning to say, right, next time you're going to be the other. And somehow it's getting through to these 4 people in my stable. But at least these 4 people got it. So I think we do have an obligation to start talking perhaps to a different audience, and that should be the audience that end up holding governments accountable for their actions. And to perhaps do it in a different language, because we speak a lot amongst each other. And we have all understood that rights are important and that they're there to protect us, but we need to communicate this better. And then I actually also, I was so struck this morning by the presentation on policies in the EU and the US. about how they wanted to close the borders for the potential, for the danger of having German spies, and the parallel for now closing borders because of the danger of terrorists coming in, instead of understanding that the people fleeing are fleeing the people who would harm us and them. And we also, I think we really need to teach the history, because we can't take for granted that, I mean, students today, many students that I see, they think history started with 9/11. And before that, there's no contact. So we might start also, or we start teaching that. I'm sorry, I'm terribly long-winded.
Can I comment?
Yes, please.
I think on Enzo's point about solutions and so on. Firstly, let me say, I have completely contrary opinions, actually, on many things. I don't know where to start. My first contrary opinion is that I don't agree that international norms are being eroded at all. What I see is a steady growth of international law, international coherence and congruence on civilized thinking, inverted commas civilized, because I come from a different civilization than most of you here. And as Mahatma Gandhi said, when asked about Western civilization, his response was he thought it would be a good idea. Now, I think the fact that we have this angst about Trumpism and Brexitery and all that is simply because we are aware that the norms are not being quite meeting the standards. That is not a question of erosion of norms. On the contrary, it is actually reflecting the fact that we have set ourselves very, very high standards that historically didn't exist. So I see that as a sign of success. The second point I want to make is, and this comes after many years of working as a government official and then as a UN official, is to learn to become honest. Okay, admittedly, even diplomats and, if I may say it, even church leaders and bureaucrats have to earn a living, so they have to go through the rituals of doing what they do. But the fact is that nobody in the whole of history ever saved anybody except through the efforts of the people themselves. Look at what happened in the Rwandan genocide. We don't have to go back into ancient history, but the fact is the Rwandan genocide was ended not because of international intervention, right? And most people in Europe, including all those millions of displaced, they helped themselves. Even even America, which is cast as the world savior now in the revised narrative of history, it came too late into the war and it did too little, and by the time it came, the genocide was mostly over. So my answer, Enzo, is let us get honest and realize that we as the international community do not and cannot save people like Fatima that I mentioned. We cannot. And the illusion we create is, and this is the dangerous illusion, that by giving the illusion that we are going to come riding over and save them, actually we disempower people from saving themselves and looking after them. And I've seen that time and time and time again in 30 years of working in the human rights and humanitarian area at the coalface. Much more honest to say to people like Fatima, may your God look after you. We are thinking of you, but we cannot save you. And get off people's backs. And you would be surprised at how capable people are at solving their own problems, given the chance and given people blocking them. So my message for the European Union, as a European Union citizen also I should say, is no one should expect the European Union to be the big savior. We leave that to the Pope. The important thing for the European Union is to stop being an obstacle to the rest of the world. And that is a strong message to the United States as well. It is not about political solutions of problems. It is about political solutions of problems, but the political solutions of problems don't come from the European Union. They don't come from the United States. In fact, their imposition of the problems creates the imposition of solutions, create the problems. Let the people breathe. Let the people find solutions. And there will be more suffering and bloodshed along the way. And bloodshed and suffering is an essential part of the condition for salvation, I'm told, by more experts who are greater in salvation. So my point here is, Enzo, let us stop looking at the international community for all this. And let us look at the local people and build up people like Fatima and all the good and kind people that are out there struggling much more successfully than we are every day saving lives.
Thank you. I think you briefly want to respond to that, Kristina? No. Then we can go to the $64 question of whether you, please.
Well, I've been asked for a prognosis for the next year. Reminds me, somebody said, never prophesize, particularly not about the future. But 2017 is not too difficult to really to give a prognosis. I think after being hugely divided at the beginning of the crisis between Merkel and Orban, there was hardly any common ground. The EU in the last months of 2015 and in 2016 achieved more of a kind of an agreement, and the agreement basically was to reduce the numbers of arrivals. That was the thing they agreed about, and they continue to build on this agreement. So in 2017, the focus will be on the one hand to keep the Balkans route closed. Can't be guaranteed. So far, the Turkey-EU agreement is holding. It's fragile. I think there's still some people coming on the Balkans route, but there's obviously more control over what's happened compared to the past. I think the emphasis in the coming months will be very much on the Libya-Italian route. There it's much more difficult, and what can be done to some extent is very hard to do for the European Union as such. I think member states individually might be more successful on this, but I think this will be the emphasis. I'm very doubtful whether we'll be very successful on the internal front. There are many proposals by the Commission, clever proposals on harmonizing migration, asylum laws, strengthening and on the burden sharing, but they're all blocked. Because what the crisis has reinforced is the process of renationalization. You cannot gain progress on the internal front without transferring more competences to common institutions, basically. It's impossible. And that is against somehow the zeitgeist, against the overall topic. And therefore, nothing much is likely to happen on this. So I don't believe in 2017 is a good year for big political initiatives. There will be a pretense of something like that here in Rome in a few weeks when we celebrate the 60th birthday of the Treaty of Rome. But don't look too careful at the document because there will not be a huge amount of substance. This year, the full focus is on national elections, basically. It's an irony that the European Parliament elections are really 28 parallel national elections, and the real national elections are the national parliament and presidential elections. So the Netherlands, then France, potentially Germany, definitely, potentially also Italy. These will be the crucial decisions for the future of the European Union. Possibly, I think just possibly at the end of the year 2017, you will have a more consolidated political situation in Europe with in the key states, new governments with strong mandates for a number of years. And just possibly in the year 2018, 2019, you can build on this kind of new consolidation and slowly move the European Union out of the present crisis.
Thank you. We have,
Yeah, just to have another comment on what you say about the erosion. I think it's a little bit of a paradox these days because it's as if we're going in two opposite directions, and I hope that we're taking one direction instead of the other. One is the building fences, building walls, saying that we don't want the other and the other doesn't need or doesn't deserve rights. And then at the same time, you have, for the first time ever, basically, migrants' rights being discussed within the UN, with the Global Compact, which is a huge step ahead. States are agreeing to coming out with some sort of document including on migrants' rights within the UN. That's something that 10 years ago we didn't even think about would be possible. So there are these very positive signs. The same can be said on the detention issues. 5 years ago, when I went out and I spoke about the best interest of the child in migration detention, I would say children need to be kept with their families in child-friendly settings. Today, it's quite clear children should never ever be kept in detention. That is the clear international position. It's the clear position of anybody who's interpreting international instruments. At the same time, we see children being thrown into detention facilities as if they were paid for it, which, by the way, they are sometimes. So there are these extremely positive developments, and then you see the fence building. So I just hope that we're going to go into the positive sides.
Well, I thank my panelists and you all for this very stimulating discussion. And now, before I leave you for coffee, I would like to talk 2 words in the IHRA name. When we planned this conference, we had a 2-field approach. Actually, in tackling the refugee problem, there was the conference, which was planned and now executed. But we also immediately wanted to do something for the teaching, which is one of our most important features. So the IHRA started a website for teachers. Anybody has access to it on the topic of refugees and migrants, and with the aim of teaching history and attacking the present at the same time. This website is now called Seeking Protection. Anybody can use it, and I all encourage you to have a look at it. And I would like to thank the Permanent Office for having saved the funds for starting and maintaining this very important instrument. Thank you very much.